Police racists laughed at the black woman in court, their voices echoing through the room like knives scraping against glass, but they stopped cold the second they saw the FBI badge flash from the inside of her coat, and what happened to them next silenced the entire courtroom. She hadn't even opened her mouth yet when they started. A group of officers posted near the defense table leaned in close, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "Another one coming to cry for her cousin," one of them said with a smirk, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Another chuckled, nudging the man beside him, "Bet she's about to pull the race card, always the same game." But it didn't stop there. As she stepped closer to the bench, their voices rose with confidence, emboldened by the quiet complicity of the courtroom. "You think just 'cause you straightened your hair, you belong here," said one. And then the final blow came, loud enough for the courtroom to turn and stare. "These black women really think they're something now, huh?" The laughter stabbed deeper than any blade. It wasn't just mockery, it was dismissal. It was every barrier she had broken, every night she had cried in silence, every inch conquistada with sweat and resolve, all reduced to a punchline between badges. She stood still, her fists clenched tight behind the case file she carried. They didn't know. They didn't have a clue who they were laughing at. And they sure as hell weren't ready for what she was about to do. The courtroom had been buzzing that morning, not with the weight of justice, but with the ease of those who thought they had already won. The case was just another page in a pile, another black woman accused of something petty she didn't do, and another set of white men ready to bury her with procedure and protocol. But this time, they chose the wrong woman to mock. This time, the silence they were about to face would be deafening. See, they saw her skin and made a decision. They heard her voice and didn't listen. They assumed she was powerless. That she was just another angry black woman too loud for her own good, too emotional to be taken seriously, too unimportant to matter. They didn't know that every word they spat was being recorded. That every insult was being catalogued. That every racist chuckle was fuel to a fire they couldn't contain. Because behind her silence, there was strategy. Behind her tears, there was training. Behind her presence, there was power. What none of them knew was that she wasn't just there to watch. She wasn't just there to defend a victim of racial profiling. She was there on assignment. Official, undisclosed, classified. Sent by the very agency they feared most. But she hadn't come to boast. She came to finish what they started. She came with names, receipts, timelines. She had evidence of misconduct, of cover-ups, of promotions handed out like favors to officers with violent pasts. She knew about the report that got buried 2 years ago, the one involving the same officer who now laughed the loudest. She knew who planted evidence in traffic stops, who turned body cams off during arrests, who threatened witnesses behind courthouse walls. She knew because she had been building the case for over a year. But first, she needed them to expose themselves. And oh, how easily they did. She gave them the rope, and they made a noose with their own words. Because when a system believes itself untouchable, it forgets to be careful. It forgets to hide its ugliness. It forgets that sometimes, the woman you mock is the one writing the report that could end your career. She waited. She let the courtroom breathe in their arrogance. Let them smile their smug smiles, thinking the verdict was already written. But the moment her hand slipped into her jacket and the badge glinted under the fluorescent lights, every breath in that room stopped. The badge wasn't fake. It wasn't borrowed. It was real, federal, undisputed, undeniable. FBI Special Agent. That same woman they joked about in front of colleagues and witnesses, was about to change their lives. What followed wasn't chaos. It was precision. It was a takedown so calm, so calculated, it left even the judge speechless. Because she didn't just reveal her identity, she flipped the entire courtroom dynamic on its head. Charges were dismissed. The accused woman wept as shackles were removed. But that was just the beginning. The real show started when she called out the names. One by one. Officers. Lawyers. Supervisors. She revealed not just their misconduct, but their connections. Their motives. Their paper trails. She showed how the system had protected them for years, and how none of them realized they were already under investigation. The courtroom became a crime scene, not because of a weapon, but because of truth. A truth so sharp it sliced through every lie ever told in that room. But here's the thing. That wasn't even the real twist. Because what she did next, the way she turned the justice system against its own gatekeepers, would shake the entire city to its core. She wasn't just there to correct a mistake. She came to dismantle a legacy of silence. And when she left that courthouse, the ones who had laughed the hardest were the first to lose everything. But the question is, how exactly did she do it? How did she, alone, bring down a network of corruption so deep it reached into the very roots of the justice system? How far was she willing to go to make them feel what she felt in that moment of humiliation? And what will you feel when you realize just how personal this story really is? Stay until the end. The real justice is yet to come. The morning air in Birmingham, Alabama, was heavy with the quiet tension that often filled the courthouse hallways. It wasn't the kind of tension born from loud voices or overt conflict, no, it was subtler, more familiar, more insidious. The kind that lingered in glances, in body language, in the hush that followed certain people into certain rooms. It was the kind of silence that told you everything you needed to know about who was welcome and who wasn't. And yet, through those very doors, in polished black heels and a tailored navy blue suit that spoke nothing of ego and everything of discipline, walked Special Agent Amara Tillman, though no one knew her name yet. To them, she was just another black woman in the courtroom, just another stranger with skin too dark to be considered important, a presence too poised to be ignored but too underestimated to be respected. Amara was 35 years old, with deep brown skin and dark, intelligent eyes that carried a lifetime of observation. She had the kind of quiet presence that made people feel watched even when she didn't speak, the kind of strength that didn't shout, didn't intimidate, it simply existed, calmly, powerfully. She had grown up on the north side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and still managed to memorize every spelling word on her daughter's test list. From an early age, Amara had learned that resilience wasn't a choice, it was the only way forward. She had always been smart, always observant, but she was never loud. She didn't need to be. She knew how to listen, how to wait, how to plan. By the time she was 22, she had graduated top of her class at Howard, and by 28, she was already making noise inside the bureau, not with dramatics, but with the kind of impeccable work that made her undeniable. But none of that mattered here. Not in this courtroom. Not to these men. Because when she walked into that place, unaccompanied, unannounced, and unassuming, the first assumption they made was that she didn't belong. The courthouse itself was an aged monument to Southern justice, high ceilings, wood-paneled walls, and a sense of self-importance that clung to the very floorboards. The security checkpoint, just past the front entrance, was manned by Officer Darren Colby, a white man in his early 50s with a permanent scowl and the kind of Southern accent that wrapped his microaggressions in politeness. As Amara approached, he gave her the kind of glance that lasted half a second too long, the kind of pause that didn't need to be explained. She offered a tight smile, not out of courtesy, but as a signal, "I see you." Down the hall, a group of uniformed officers gathered outside courtroom 3C. Their laughter was casual, their postures relaxed, too relaxed for men supposedly there in service of justice. Among them stood Officer Jake Matherson, lean, blond, early 40s, with a sharp jaw and a sharper tongue. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been truly held accountable for anything. His sidekick, Officer Reese Donnelly, was younger, louder, and more reckless, with the kind of smirk that women often called punchable. They noticed Amara the moment she stepped into their line of vision, and their attention shifted like a spotlight on stage. They didn't recognize her. Not yet. And because they didn't, they did what they were used to doing, they mocked her. It started with quiet chuckles and eye rolls. Then, the whispering began, not to hide their words, but to dress them up in plausible deniability. "Bet she's here to cry for her cousin," one said. "Or maybe give the 'we're all the same' speech," another added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Amara heard it all. She always did. But she didn't respond. Not yet. Inside the courtroom, the case that had brought her here was being prepped for hearing. A young black woman, no more than 24, sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a public defender who looked more stressed than prepared. The woman had been arrested after a routine traffic stop had somehow escalated into a felony charge, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, obstruction of justice. It didn't take a genius to understand what really happened, only someone willing to look. But in this courtroom, willing eyes were rare. Judge Ronald T. Whitmore presided over the room like it was his kingdom. A man in his 60s, with thick glasses and a deep voice that made every word feel like a verdict, Whitmore was known for his impatience with what he called social distractions. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like being corrected. And he certainly didn't like having to listen to anyone who didn't look or sound like him. Amara took a seat near the back of the courtroom, choosing a spot that gave her full view of everyone, the judge, the jury box, the prosecutors, the officers clustered near the door. She wasn't there to be seen. Not yet. She was there to watch. To listen. To confirm. Across the aisle, ADA Thomas Kellerman organized his notes, rehearsing his opening statement with an air of smugness that clung to him like cologne. He was one of those men who spoke in facts, even when they weren't true, because he had learned long ago that confidence often mattered more than accuracy. To him, this was just another case, another win. He had no interest in nuance. No patience for context. As the proceedings began, Amara took in every detail, the way the officers shifted in their seats, the way the judge leaned forward when Kellerman spoke but barely looked up when the defense attorney tried to object. She noted how the jury, mostly white, mostly older, glanced at the defendant like she had already done something wrong just by sitting there. It wasn't overt. That was the danger of it. It was quiet. Systemic. Routine. But outside that routine, Amara was building something else. Not a defense, a reckoning. She had come to Birmingham for a reason. The case was the surface, but underneath it lived something bigger. A pattern. A system. A culture of silence among officers who protected each other at any cost, judges who turned blind eyes, prosecutors who prioritized conviction rates over truth. She had been following this trail for months, and every breadcrumb had led her here. To this courtroom. To these men. To this moment. What they didn't know was that her presence there wasn't a coincidence. It was the final step in an investigation they never saw coming. But for now, Amara kept her cover. She let them look. Let them laugh. Let them assume. Because she knew something they didn't, the greatest power lies in being underestimated. She had been waiting for this moment her whole life, and she wasn't about to rush it. She watched the officers whisper and grin, watched the judge dismiss objections like swatting flies, watched the prosecutor speak with a certainty he didn't earn. And as she sat there, calm, composed, unseen, she felt none of the rage they expected from women like her. She felt something deeper. Something colder. A clarity sharpened by years of watching men like them play God with people's lives. And she knew, justice wasn't coming for them. It was already here, sitting quietly in the back of the room, waiting for the right time to rise. And when it did, the world they knew would never be the same. The next morning brought with it the same slow, oppressive heat that seemed to settle permanently over Birmingham like a second skin. Amara woke early, her body still and mind already working, scanning through every detail she'd gathered the day before. She sat at the edge of her hotel bed, staring at the file folders spread across the table, each one meticulously labeled, filled with photos, reports, testimonies, and hidden threads that connected people in that courthouse to a much larger picture. This wasn't about a single defendant anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. What was unfolding now was the culmination of 2 years of relentless work, a web of corruption, cover-ups, and quiet cruelty that no one in power had expected would ever be challenged. They thought they had buried the truth under years of authority and procedure. What they didn't know was that the truth was now staring them in the face, and it had a badge. Amara entered the courthouse that day with the same expressionless calm she had mastered over a lifetime. She didn't wear arrogance. She didn't strut. She simply moved with the kind of confidence that couldn't be taught, the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she carried. As she passed through security, Officer Colby barely looked up. There was no recognition in his eyes. No flicker of guilt. Just the dull indifference of a man who thought yesterday was already forgotten. Inside courtroom 3C, the air was different. Something had shifted. The whispers weren't as loud. The laughter had faded. But the energy hadn't disappeared, it had simply turned inward, warier now, uncertain. ADA Kellerman glanced at Amara when she entered, his gaze briefly sharpening before dismissing her again. It was almost amusing, watching him try to assess her without realizing she was already 10 steps ahead. The trial continued with the same exhausting rhythm. The prosecution laid out its case, bland and confident, painting the defendant as hostile, erratic, dangerous. The body cam footage was conveniently edited. The narrative was clean. Too clean. Amara watched as the public defender tried to object, tried to poke holes, but it was like throwing pebbles at a concrete wall. The judge waved away concerns, the jury sat expressionless, and the officers who had made the arrest sat smugly nearby, their uniforms starched, their faces blank masks of fake professionalism. During a recess, Amara stepped into the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear as she whispered details to someone on the other end. Her voice was low, but urgent, requesting confirmation on a specific document, asking for timestamps on a traffic stop from 3 months prior, referencing a file number that no one else in this building even knew existed. Behind her, Officer Matherson and Officer Donnelly watched her from a distance, their curiosity visibly irritated. Donnelly leaned over and muttered something about her being nosy, and Matherson laughed, but it wasn't the same as before. There was tension in it now. Something they couldn't quite name. Later that day, when court resumed, Amara did something subtle, but deliberate. She stood and walked to the front bench, closer to the defense table, her steps calm, composed. She leaned into the young woman on trial, whispered something, a quiet word of reassurance, and then looked directly at the judge, nodding once, before returning to her seat. It was a small act, but one that disrupted the flow. The judge looked confused for a moment. Kellerman shifted uncomfortably. The officers in the back straightened. It was the first real crack in the performance. Later, in the hallway, Kellerman approached her. His smile was thin, and there was a sharpness behind it, a warning dressed as charm. He asked what she was doing there, what her role was, and whether she had authorization to interfere with a trial in progress. Amara smiled back, a soft, unreadable smile, and said she was observing. Just a concerned citizen, she said. The look on Kellerman's face faltered for half a second before he walked away. That night, Amara met with a contact in a quiet corner booth of a diner 10 miles from downtown. A former officer. Someone who had once believed in the badge until it broke him. He handed her a flash drive under the table, his hands shaking. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. She returned to her hotel, locked the door, and slid the drive into her laptop. What she saw made her chest tighten. It was all there, unredacted bodycam footage, internal memos, a chain of ignored complaints, reports marked inconclusive despite overwhelming evidence. The same officers from the courtroom. The same judge. The same prosecutor. All part of it. The next morning, Amara wore her badge around her neck, not to flaunt it, but because she no longer needed to hide. The endgame had begun. She arrived early, sitting near the front, letting everyone see what they had missed all along. The reaction was immediate. Officer Colby blinked twice. Matherson stared. Donnelly leaned in and whispered, "Wait, she's FBI." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't need to confirm anything. Her presence was the confirmation. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a different energy. The judge took longer pauses between rulings. Kellerman's tone was less certain. The public defender, sensing something shifting, became bolder, asking sharper questions, presenting overlooked inconsistencies. Amara watched everything. Calculated everything. The jury noticed her now. People adjusted their posture when she walked by. In the hallway during recess, Donnelly couldn't help himself. He approached her, trying to play it off with a half-smile, a forced laugh. He asked what division she was with, tried to joke about being caught off guard. Amara tilted her head slightly, her gaze unblinking, and simply said, "You should be more careful about what you say in court. Especially when you think no one's listening." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his smirk melting. Later that afternoon, the court reconvened, and the defense presented a surprise motion. A motion to suppress based on new evidence, unaltered body cam footage that contradicted the prosecution's entire narrative. Kellerman objected furiously. The judge's face went stiff. The footage was queued up. The jury leaned forward. Everyone's eyes locked on the screen. And that's where the tension rose like a tide. Because what played on the screen wasn't just a different version of events. It was the truth, raw and ugly. It showed the arrest from start to finish, the insults, the unnecessary force, the moment an officer turned off his mic before slamming the defendant into the ground. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was fact. Whispers erupted in the courtroom. The judge called for order. Kellerman's face flushed. The officers looked at each other, not sure what would happen next. And through it all, Amara sat still, calm, her eyes never leaving the screen. Because this wasn't just about one woman's innocence. This was about the system finally looking at its own reflection and realizing what it had become. But no one, not even those watching closely, knew what Amara was really holding back. The flash drive was only part of it. The documents, the witness testimony, the timeline, they were the setup. The real blow was still coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just shake the courtroom. It would tear through every layer of protection these men had built around themselves. The reckoning wasn't coming. It was already here, waiting for its moment to strike. The courtroom was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that usually followed a judge's command for order, not the performative hush that lingered between statements. This silence was dense, electric, the kind that wrapped around people's throats and made them forget how to breathe. Every pair of eyes in the room had turned to Amara as she rose from her seat and stepped toward the bench. Even Judge Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming once against the edge of his seat before stopping. The defense attorney stood aside, unsure what was happening but certain that something irreversible was about to unfold. ADA Kellerman tried to keep his composure, tried to maintain the calm, rehearsed posture he had worn throughout the trial, but the look in his eyes betrayed him, he knew. Not everything. But enough to feel the tide changing under his feet. Amara didn't rush. She placed a folder on the table in front of the judge, her fingers never trembling. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, "I request permission to present classified material to the court under emergency disclosure protocol, per federal oversight of law enforcement misconduct." Her badge hung from her neck now, unmistakable under the courtroom lights. It glinted once, and for the first time since the proceedings began, no one dared to interrupt her. The judge opened the folder. He stared down at the documents inside, and his face lost all its practiced stoicism. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice low. "I've been working undercover for 19 months, embedded across multiple jurisdictions," she replied without hesitation. "This courtroom, this department, this entire circuit, they're part of an active federal investigation." She turned to the jury, her voice clear but heavy. Everything you've seen so far has been carefully controlled. But this case, this young woman's trial, is built on a pattern of deception, misconduct, and racial bias covered up by those sworn to uphold justice. There was a long pause. Kellerman stepped forward. Your Honor, I move to. You don't move for anything, Amara snapped, her tone sudden and sharp enough to cut through the air. You sit, and you listen. You've had your turn. The judge said nothing. He glanced at the bailiff and nodded. The doors locked with a soft electronic click. No one would be walking out of this room until everything came out. Amara walked to the front of the courtroom and plugged a small device into the media console. The monitor flickered. Then a screen lit up with names, 24 names. Officers, attorneys, supervisors, even a few administrative staff. A title appeared above them, Subjects of Internal Investigation, DOJ Civil Rights Division. The room fell into stunned silence. The woman on trial today, Amara continued, gesturing to the defendant, was targeted during a traffic stop. That's what you were told. What you weren't told is that this stop was part of an internal pattern logged by a whistleblower in your department, stops targeting young black individuals under fabricated pretenses in high incarceration zip codes. What you weren't told is that this woman was followed for 2 miles before being pulled over for a broken taillight that never existed. That when she asked for a supervisor, her car was surrounded. And when she was pulled out, shoved to the pavement, and cuffed, the officers who did it knew exactly what they were doing, because they'd done it before. She pressed a button. The screen shifted to bodycam footage, unedited, timestamped, raw. Gasps broke out as the courtroom watched. The defendant being pulled, handcuffed. Her screams ignored. A voice off camera saying, "Make sure that mic's off before you write that report." Then a blur, a scuffle, silence. Kellerman stood again, but this time his voice cracked as he tried to object. This is out of scope, Amara's voice cut through his again. Out of scope. You built a case on lies and violence, and you want to talk about scope. Then she turned to the jury. Her tone shifted. Softer now, but heavy with truth. I know what you're thinking. I know you're wondering how far this goes. I'm here to tell you, it goes farther than you're ready to believe. This isn't about one woman. It's not even about this courtroom. It's about a culture that feeds on fear and silence. And I've come to end it. The judge looked ill. His face had gone pale. He adjusted his robe, sweat forming at his temple. Agent Tillman, he said slowly, what do you expect this court to do? Amara's eyes locked onto his. I expect you to do your job. And when that fails, I expect the truth to do it for you. From the back of the room, Officer Matherson stood, his face red. This is insane. She's not even, this is a setup, it's political, she turned to him. Sit down, Officer Matherson. Or should I play the footage from March 14th? The one where you slammed a teenager's head into your squad car and turned your bodycam off while laughing about it afterward? That file's ready too. His mouth opened, then shut again. Whispers turned into murmurs. The jury shifted. One woman began to cry quietly, her hand covering her mouth. The defendant sat frozen, not yet able to process what was happening. Her public defender stared at Amara with something close to disbelief. Amara pulled another file from her bag. This, she said, placing it gently on the table, is an internal disciplinary recommendation for Officer Reese Donnelly. Dated 3 months ago. It includes a sworn statement from a female arrestee alleging assault. The statement was buried. The file never made it to IA. But it made it to me. She paused. Do you know why it never went through? Because Kellerman advised the department it would harm morale. Because Judge Whitmore signed a sealed order halting its progression without notifying the plaintiff. The judge flinched. That file was confidential, and yet here we are, Amara said. There was nowhere to hide anymore. No smirks. No laughter. No quick dismissals. Kellerman's voice trembled when he spoke again. You don't get to walk into my courtroom and hijack the law. Amara turned to face him fully now, her voice lower, deliberate. You think this is your courtroom? This courtroom belongs to the people. To the ones you failed. To the ones you silenced. To every single family that walked through these doors hoping for justice and left with nothing but grief. You made it yours by turning it into a machine, one that punished people who looked like me and protected people who looked like you. But that ends now. The judge leaned forward, speaking to the bailiff in a whisper. The bailiff nodded and exited through a side door. Amara didn't wait. She held up her phone, pressing play. An audio recording began to echo through the chamber. It was Kellerman's voice, unmistakable, on a call made months ago. I don't care what the file says, bury it. I'm not blowing this case because some mouthy girl wants to play the race card. Tell Whitmore to seal it. We're not setting a precedent here. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amara stepped closer to the jury. This trial isn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about truth. And you have a chance, right now, to see it for what it is. A soft knock came from the side door. 2 federal agents entered the courtroom. They moved quietly, one stepping beside Kellerman, the other beside Matherson. Warrants were handed over. Kellerman froze. This is a mistake. This is all a misunderstanding. Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The sound of handcuffs closing spoke louder than anything else. The judge stood, but before he could speak, another agent handed him a sealed envelope. He opened it. Read. Sat back down without a word. The defendant turned slowly to look at Amara, her eyes wide. Who are you? She whispered. Amara gave a small, tired smile. Someone who got tired of waiting for justice. And as the courtroom dissolved into controlled chaos, agents moving, papers shuffling, people rising to speak, to shout, to ask, Amara stepped back. She didn't need the spotlight. She had done what she came to do. But something in her eyes said it wasn't over. Because this was only the beginning. The courtroom had never felt that alive, not in years, maybe not ever. But it wasn't the kind of life anyone wanted. It was a pulse of exposed nerves, of reputations unraveling, of whispered fears that suddenly found their voice. The quiet murmurs that had once circulated through the halls now exploded into confusion and disbelief. Agents escorted ADA Kellerman out of the room, and his silence as he walked past the jurors, head low, hands cuffed, felt louder than any closing argument he had ever delivered. Officer Matherson was next, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed like it might shatter. He didn't say a word, not even when one of the jurors gasped and recognized him from a complaint she'd once filed and never heard back from. Donnelly, usually so loud, so full of empty swagger, looked completely hollowed out, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for a version of reality where this wasn't happening to him. The young woman who had been on trial sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. It was too much to process, not just the shock of being freed, but the weight of what it had taken to get here. She turned her eyes to Amara, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her public defender, still holding his legal pad like it could protect him from the truth just unleashed, finally exhaled. I don't know what you just did, he whispered, leaning toward Amara, but I've never seen anything like that. Not here. Not anywhere. Amara didn't look at him. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the judge, who still sat behind his bench like a man staring into a mirror he didn't want to recognize. Judge Whitmore tried to reclaim his authority, clearing his throat as if that could restore the hierarchy that had just been blown to pieces. He straightened his robe, reached for his gavel, then hesitated when he realized no one was looking to him for order anymore. The air in the room didn't belong to him. He was no longer the tallest figure in the room. "This court is in recess until further notice," he said eventually, the words barely audible. Then he stood and turned to leave, but one of the federal agents blocked his path. "Judge Whitmore, we need you to remain," the agent said with clinical calm, handing him another sealed document. "There's an ongoing federal inquiry, and your cooperation is required." That was the moment it finally broke him. Not dramatically. Not publicly. But in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he slowly sat back down without resistance, like the power had been drained from his spine. Amara watched it all unfold without flinching. She had seen men like him collapse under the weight of their own unchecked arrogance before. She never celebrated it. But she always made sure they understood that the fall was theirs to own. As the room slowly emptied, Amara remained. The defendant, still trembling, approached her, not with questions, but with something much harder to voice. "They said I attacked them," she said, voice soft, shaking, "and no one listened. My own lawyer told me to take a deal. My own family stopped visiting. They said it wasn't worth fighting, that nobody beats the system." Her voice cracked. "Why did you?" Amara's reply was gentle but heavy. "Because people like you aren't supposed to disappear. And people like them aren't supposed to keep winning." The young woman nodded, wiping a tear that escaped before she could stop it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. That moment was too big for gratitude. It wasn't about favors. It was about survival. Outside the courtroom, the news had already begun to spread. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, pushing microphones into the faces of anyone wearing a badge or suit. Whispers turned into headlines. Internal Affairs launched parallel inquiries. The mayor's office released a statement within the hour, full of carefully chosen words that said very little, but tried to sound like accountability. The city wasn't ready for this kind of exposure. And it wasn't just Birmingham. Federal oversight meant broader implications. What happened in courtroom 3C would ripple out across the country. Policies would be questioned. Names would be scrutinized. Careers would end. Amara made her way down the corridor, past portraits of old judges, plaques commemorating service, and security guards who now looked at her with the kind of respect that only fear could buy. She walked with the same calm she'd entered with, but inside, something deeper churned. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even relief. It was resolve. She had cut the first head off a beast that had many more. And she wasn't done. At the end of the hallway, she spotted Officer Colby. He stood frozen near the exit, holding his radio like it could still shield him from what he'd witnessed. His eyes met hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I didn't know. I didn't realize you were with the Bureau." Amara stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "That's the problem. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being." He nodded, slowly, shame creeping into his face like a stain. "I was just doing my job." Her response came like a blade, steady and true. "If doing your job means dehumanizing people, then maybe the job is the problem." He didn't answer. He stepped aside. Let her pass. Back in her car, Amara sat in silence for a long moment before dialing a number. When the line picked up, she spoke calmly. "It's done. Phase 1 is complete. I'll forward all case files to the Oversight Committee by tonight." She paused, listening. No, they weren't ready. That's the point. She hung up and stared out the windshield. The courthouse behind her looked different now, smaller. And yet, what happened inside it would echo long after she was gone. Later that night, sitting alone in her hotel room, Amara opened her laptop and began uploading the full report. Names. Footage. Audio. Patterns of abuse. Recommendations for disciplinary action and prosecution. It was all there. No redactions. No filters. Just the truth, finally visible in its entirety. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. One line, "They know who you are now." She stared at it. Then deleted it. Let them know. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but it wasn't the kind that begged for sleep. It was the kind that reminded her how long the road ahead still was. One courtroom down. Dozens more to go. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement. And she had just set it in motion. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline of Birmingham, the city felt different. It wasn't louder, and it wasn't visibly changed, but it was heavier, like it had been forced to look itself in the mirror and was still reeling from what it saw. Inside offices, judges and attorneys watched replays of the courtroom footage on muted television screens, whispering about what would happen next. Department heads scrambled through old files, looking for anything that might now be considered evidence. Phones rang unanswered. Internal chat threads went silent. The echo of Amara's intervention stretched far beyond the walls of courtroom 3C. She had triggered something they couldn't undo, and the institutions that once felt untouchable now trembled under their own weight. Amara didn't go back to her hotel room immediately. She sat in her car for over an hour after sending the report, watching the city breathe through her windshield. There were no congratulations waiting for her. No applause. The system she'd just rattled was not one that sent flowers or medals. It protected itself. It repaired its image, not its structure. And she knew the most dangerous part was not what had just happened, it was what would follow. People would try to minimize it. Reframe it. There would be attempts to paint her as radical, as emotional, as disruptive. The strategy was always the same: shift the conversation from what was done to how it was done. She knew all the tactics, because she had studied them for years. Back at the field office, Amara met with her supervisor, Special Agent Miriam Flores. A woman who had fought her own silent battles against the institution she worked in, Flores greeted Amara with a nod and a long, measured look. "You've opened a door we can't close now," she said, her voice low. Amara nodded, responding, "That was the point." Flores pulled up the internal comms report. Dozens of messages, calls, even threats had already come through, some from public officials, others anonymous. "They're coming for your credibility," she warned. "They'll look into everything you've ever filed, every testimony you've ever given. You know that, right?" Amara looked her in the eye and said, "I've spent a decade making sure I'm clean. They won't find what they're hoping for." Flores sighed, a deep breath pulled from the bottom of her chest. "Just make sure you're ready for what this does to your life. Because the truth has a cost." And she was right. Within 24 hours, news channels across the country had picked up the story. Some networks praised Amara's bravery, calling her a whistleblower, a reformer. Others painted her as an agent gone rogue, someone driven by personal bias, spinning narratives to suit a political agenda. Social media erupted, divided and chaotic, as always. Some called for widespread reform, others for her badge. Hashtags trended. Politicians issued statements, most carefully crafted to appear neutral. But in the middle of all the noise, one undeniable truth remained: the system had been forced to confront itself, and Amara was the one who lit the fuse. Back in Birmingham, the courthouse remained in a kind of uneasy limbo. Several cases were postponed indefinitely, pending internal review. The local police department announced a temporary suspension of all discretionary stops while investigations unfolded. The community responded with a mix of vindication and skepticism. This wasn't the first time they'd heard promises, seen brief flashes of accountability. Amara understood this too well. Justice wasn't about singular moments, it was about sustained pressure. And pressure required presence. She was invited to a community meeting at a local civic center, a modest space with flickering lights and plastic chairs, but filled wall to wall with people who came to hear the woman they'd watched dismantle a courtroom. The moment she walked in, the room quieted. Not out of intimidation, but reverence. People made space for her. Not just physically, they made emotional space. To see her. To hear her. To ask her if she could really do what she had started. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded Union jacket, stood up during the Q&A. His voice trembled not with fear, but with emotion worn thin by decades of disappointment. "Agent Tillman," he said, "how do we know this isn't just another moment that gets swallowed by the next scandal? How do we know this ain't just another flame that dies out when the wind picks up?" Amara let the silence linger before responding. "Because I'm not leaving. And I'm not the only one. This isn't about one case or one courtroom. It's about showing people they're not alone. That when they speak, they'll be heard, not silenced." Her words landed like anchors in the room, grounding people who had floated for too long on empty promises. A young woman at the back, maybe 20, raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" she asked. "To stand up to them like that?" Amara answered without flinching. "Of course I was. But I was more afraid of what would happen if no one did." As she left the center, a quiet weight followed her, not sadness, but responsibility. The people believed in her now. And belief was dangerous. Because if she failed them, it would only feed the hopelessness she had worked so hard to challenge. She drove through neighborhoods she had studied in her case files, places where complaints had piled up and never been acknowledged. She passed a corner where 3 teenagers had been searched without cause last spring. She saw the invisible scars on the city and knew that justice, to truly matter, couldn't just be delivered, it had to be lived. But back in the bureau, not everyone saw her as a hero. Meetings behind closed doors discussed the optics of her actions. Some higher-ups questioned her methods, her timing, her motives. An internal memo circulated, subtly suggesting that agents in the field should adhere more strictly to the chain of command. Amara read it and laughed under her breath. They weren't brave enough to name her, but she recognized the language of suppression when she saw it. Still, a part of her wondered, how many more battles would she have to fight within her own agency? Could she expose corruption in one system without being swallowed by another? Then came a call that made her sit up straighter. It was from the Justice Department. They wanted her to testify. Not just in internal affairs or in the Birmingham investigation, but at a congressional hearing on racial bias in law enforcement. Her name was now attached to a movement, whether she liked it or not. She was asked to speak as both a federal agent and a black woman, someone who had stood on both sides of the line, someone who had watched the system devour people who looked like her, then dared to fight it from the inside. That night, she walked alone through a quiet stretch of the city, her thoughts spiraling. The invitation felt like a moment of triumph, but it also terrified her. What would she say? How could she represent all the stories she had uncovered, all the lives scarred by injustice, in a few brief minutes of testimony? And if she told the truth, the whole truth, would she still have a place in the bureau afterward? The dilemma wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. To tell the story right, she'd have to include herself in it. Her childhood. Her mother. The days when she was told to be careful around police. The mornings she ran faster in school not just to win, but to prove she was good enough to be seen. She sat on a bench and stared up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind city lights, but she imagined them watching anyway. She thought about legacy, what it meant to build something that would outlast her, to be remembered not for how well she followed the rules, but for how bravely she rewrote them. But to do that, she'd have to risk everything. Her badge. Her career. Her safety. And she knew the world wouldn't thank her for it. But maybe, just maybe, someone would be safer because she did. As the breeze moved through the trees and the streets slowly quieted, Amara made her decision. The hearing was in 5 days. And when she stood before that committee, she wouldn't just be speaking as an agent. She'd be speaking as a witness, as an advocate, and as a warning. Because the system had been exposed. But the real fight was just beginning. 5 days was not a long time, but it felt like a lifetime compressed into every minute. The hours stretched and collapsed around Amara as she prepared for the congressional hearing, each moment demanding more than the last. The noise outside only grew louder. New headlines emerged each morning, some praising her, others tearing her apart. Talk shows debated whether she was a hero or a threat to institutional order. Politicians used her name to push their agendas, some holding her up as a symbol of courage, others branding her as reckless. Her inbox overflowed, reporters, activists, victims' families, fellow agents offering quiet support, and others, more cowardly, warning her to stay in line. But through it all, Amara stayed focused. She didn't need their validation. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. She had held it in her hands. She spent late nights in the quiet of her hotel room going through case files again, not because she needed to, she had them memorized, but because it was her way of honoring the people inside those folders. They weren't numbers or talking points. They were voices that had been silenced, stories buried under legal jargon and bureaucratic language. She had promised herself that when she stood before Congress, she would speak for them. Not with statistics or generalizations, but with the raw, unfiltered weight of reality. It had to hurt. It had to shake them. On the eve of the hearing, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. The voice on the other end was cautious, male, young. He said he was a patrol officer from another city. He'd seen the footage. He'd watched the full hearing. Then he went quiet for a second, as if trying to find the courage to keep speaking. When he did, his voice cracked. He said he had seen similar things happen in his own department. That he had stayed silent. That he hated himself for it. Then he said something Amara would carry with her for the rest of her life, not because of how it made her feel, but because of what it represented. He said, "I didn't think I was allowed to speak until I saw you do it." Amara didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally, she replied, "You always were. They just didn't want you to know that." She arrived in Washington with a guarded calm. The Capitol had a way of shrinking everything into sound bites and political theater, but Amara had no intention of being performative. She wore a plain suit. No makeup. No accessories. She wanted them to see her as she was, not polished, not curated, but resolute. As she walked through the halls of Congress, she passed by portraits of men who had written laws with no faces like hers in mind. She felt the stares from aides and lobbyists, some curious, others hostile. But none of it moved her. Her feet were steady. Her purpose clear. Inside the chamber, the committee members sat in polished seats behind long wooden desks, their expressions carefully neutral. The room was packed. Media filled the back rows. Staffers leaned in, pens ready. Amara sat alone at the witness table. A nameplate before her read, "Special Agent Amara Tillman, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The chairwoman welcomed her, thanked her for her service, and then opened the floor. Amara adjusted the microphone, glanced at the committee, and began to speak. She didn't start with statistics. She didn't talk about reforms or oversight or protocols. She started with a name, the name of the young woman whose trial she had intervened in. She told the story not as an agent, but as a witness. She described what she saw, what she heard, how she felt sitting in that courtroom, watching justice twisted into something unrecognizable. Her voice didn't shake, but it wasn't cold either. It carried weight. Anger without rage. Pain without pity. Then she moved on. She spoke about the patterns she had uncovered, the internal memos that documented violations, the culture that rewarded silence and punished conscience. She named departments. Not all. Just enough. She read excerpts from emails where victims were dismissed. Played a short clip of body cam footage that never made it to public record. There was no gasping, no outrage. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes when people know they've run out of excuses. One of the committee members leaned forward, an older senator with decades in the system. He asked if she believed the Bureau was still capable of holding itself accountable. Amara looked directly at him and said, I believe individuals within the system want to do the right thing. But systems don't change because of intention. They change when they're forced to confront their reflection. Another asked what reforms she recommended. Amara paused before answering, then said, you don't fix a wound by covering it. You fix it by cleaning it out, even if it hurts. The most difficult question came from a congresswoman who had once been a public defender. She asked Amara what price she had paid for her decision. Amara didn't speak right away. Then she said, I've lost friends in the field. I've lost the trust of people who once called me family. I've been called disloyal. I've been warned not to push too far. But the worst part, the part one wasn't prepared for, was realizing how many people already knew and chose to do nothing. Her voice lowered. That price is heavier than all the rest. After the hearing, she stepped into the hallway and was immediately swarmed by reporters. Flashes went off, questions hurled. She kept walking, not out of arrogance, but because the performance was over. Her part was done. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, activists, students, community leaders. Some cheered. Some cried. One older woman stepped forward and touched Amara's hand gently. She didn't say anything. Just looked at her like she was something sacred. And that meant more than any applause. But even as Amara returned to her office the next day, the reality of what she had started began to settle deeper. A new internal review had been ordered. Several of her colleagues were reassigned. One of her closest allies had requested a transfer, too uncomfortable with the spotlight now following her. Not everyone who clapped for her wanted to stand beside her. She sat alone in her office, the lights low, replaying the hearing in her mind, wondering what would be different in a month, in a year. Then she got a message, a short, encrypted note from an anonymous source. It included a file, marked with a department name she recognized from one of her early investigations, a place she hadn't been able to crack. Inside were pages of logs, reports, internal chats between officers mocking victims and manipulating evidence. She stared at the screen for a long time before reaching for her recorder. She had opened one door. But now others were beginning to open too. And with each one, the truth became harder to hide. Amara stared at the files on her screen for what felt like hours, the dim light of her office casting long shadows across the room as the world outside moved obliviously forward. The documents she had received were detailed, disturbingly precise, timestamps, badge numbers, chat logs where officers joked about cleaning up reports, deleting footage, planting paraphernalia to justify stops. It was worse than she'd imagined. Not because she didn't expect it, but because the casual tone in which it was all discussed revealed something deeper, more disturbing. They didn't feel fear. They felt invincible. That kind of confidence didn't come from individuals, it came from culture, from decades of being protected, ignored, enabled. She scrolled through the names and paused on one in particular. A supervisor she had once interviewed for an unrelated case, someone who had looked her in the eye and said, I don't see color, I just follow protocol. And yet, here he was, in black and white, laughing at a group message titled, Another One Bites the Dust, referring to a teenager whose charges had been inflated to justify detainment. Amara closed her laptop slowly, trying to still the rage that built in her chest like a storm held behind glass. The next day, she requested a private meeting with Special Agent Miriam Flores. In the silence of the office, the air between them heavy, Amara laid out the new evidence without hesitation. Flores didn't speak for a long time after reading the first few pages. Then she leaned back and said, You understand what happens if we pursue this, right? Amara nodded. We're not just talking about a precinct this time. We're talking about an entire department. Statewide implications. Federal funding. Political allies. Amara's voice was steady. And victims. Lots of them. We don't get to walk away from this just because it's bigger than what we planned for. Flores sighed, her hands folded tightly on the desk. They'll come for us harder. Smarter. You might be ready to lose everything. But are you ready to make other people lose it with you? That question hung between them like a blade. Amara knew the answer wasn't simple. She'd already seen what happened when she pulled one thread, a courtroom unraveled, a city panicked, and people who had once whispered support were now silent again, unwilling to sacrifice their own comfort for justice. But this wasn't about protecting her career. It was about whether she could sleep at night knowing what she had seen, knowing there were names in those files whose lives had already been lost or destroyed. She looked Flores in the eye and said, "If they come for us, let them. But I won't be the one who turns my back first." The investigation began quietly. Just a few files, a few conversations. No press. No leaks. Amara worked late, often alone, combing through thousands of pages, cross-referencing dates and complaints. Victims who had long stopped expecting justice began getting calls. Some were hesitant. Others were furious. A few broke down the moment they heard Amara's voice, unable to believe someone was still fighting. One man, a former teacher who had lost his job after a false charge stuck to his record, spent 10 minutes in silence before simply saying, "I prayed for this." Amara didn't try to offer comfort. She just listened. It wasn't her job to fix what was broken, but to make sure the people who broke it never did again. But with each step forward, the pressure mounted. One evening, as she left the field office, she noticed a car parked across the street that didn't belong. It didn't follow her, but it didn't need to. It was a message. Subtle, but deliberate. Days later, a letter arrived at her apartment. No return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about whistleblowers who had mysteriously vanished after exposing government secrets. No direct threats. Just enough to make her pause. She handed everything to internal security. They told her to be cautious. To keep her head down. Amara laughed, bitter and tired. That part of me died in courtroom 3C. One afternoon, she was called into a board meeting with senior bureau officials. They wore polite expressions, but Amara had been in too many rooms like that to be fooled. One of them, Assistant Director Hale, leaned forward and said, "Agent Tillman, your commitment to transparency is admirable. But we're concerned about optics. About the bureau being politicized." Amara didn't blink. "Truth isn't political." Another agent chimed in. "Perhaps. But your face is on every network right now. That makes you a symbol. Symbols are polarizing." Amara held his gaze. Then maybe the system shouldn't give people so much to polarize over. The meeting ended with no resolution, just veiled suggestions that she consider stepping back, taking leave, protecting herself. But she knew what they really meant. They wanted her quiet. They didn't want another headline. Too late. A week later, another whistleblower contacted her. This time, from within the state attorney's office. A young paralegal who had stumbled upon a chain of emails detailing how prosecutors had been coached by police on how to present fabricated narratives in court, how to discredit defense witnesses, how to bury inconvenient evidence. Amara met with her in a coffee shop on the edge of the city. The young woman looked terrified, her hands trembling as she passed over the flash drive. "I'm not brave like you," she said, eyes darting around. Amara took her hand gently. "You don't have to be brave all the time. You just have to be honest." The girl cried, quietly. Amara stayed until she calmed. As more evidence piled in, the web widened. What began as a courtroom victory was now a movement dragging hidden truths into the light. Amara found herself working with a growing network, activists, lawyers, honest officers, tech specialists analyzing data sets for bias. She wasn't alone anymore. And that terrified the people who still held power. Because one woman could be silenced. But not a movement. Still, the cost bled into every corner of her life. Old friends stopped calling. Her family grew quiet. Her younger brother, who had once looked up to her like a superhero, now asked questions laced with fear. "They're watching you, right?" he asked one night on the phone. "What if something happens?" Amara wanted to lie, to protect him, but she didn't. "Then it happens," she said. "But at least I'll know I didn't look away." The hardest moment came weeks later when she sat with the mother of a boy who had died during an arrest. His name had been on the list from the flash drive. His file had been labeled non-viable complaint. His mother held a photo of him in her hands, her fingers trembling over the frame. "Do you think they'll ever say his name?" she asked. Amara looked at her, tears rising to her eyes. "They will. I'll make sure of it." And in that moment, she knew what the end would look like. Not a courtroom. Not a headline. But a name spoken aloud in a room that once refused to hear it. She returned to her office that night and began drafting her next report, one that wouldn't just detail corruption, but propose a new framework for community accountability, for real-time transparency, for protection of those who dared to speak. It wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't fix everything. But it would be the beginning of something no one could ignore. The storm was still coming. But Amara wasn't running from it. She was walking directly into it, and this time, she wasn't alone. 3 months after the congressional hearing, Amara stood before a crowd of thousands on the steps of the same courthouse where everything had begun. But this time, there were no walls of silence, no condescending stares, no hidden smirks behind uniforms. There were voices, loud, clear, and united. Survivors of wrongful convictions, families of the silenced, former officers who had chosen conscience over complicity, activists who had been waiting for this kind of moment their entire lives. The city had not changed overnight, and no revolution had signed itself into law, but something far more permanent had taken root: accountability. And Amara, once mocked and dismissed, was now recognized as the federal appointee to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Oversight Committee, a newly created division with real authority and independent enforcement. She was now the one in the room making the decisions. And for the first time, the people knew her name not as a symbol of resistance, but as a force of transformation. The cases she had opened led to real consequences. Ada Kellerman was disbarred and faced federal obstruction charges. His trial had begun behind closed doors, but the pressure from public outcry forced it into transparency. In the end, he took a plea, not because he was remorseful, but because he knew there was no longer a path to escape accountability. Officer Matherson lost his pension and was sentenced to 6 years after a jury watched the full breadth of his abuse captured through years of hidden footage. Donnelly tried to cut a deal, but his cooperation came too late. His sentence was shorter, but his name became synonymous with cowardice in the face of justice. Judge Whitmore resigned in disgrace after internal documents surfaced, revealing decades of biased rulings and backdoor dealings. His portrait, once hanging high in the courthouse hall, was taken down by the very people who had once sat in fear before him. In a twist no one could have predicted, the bailiff, a quiet, unassuming man who had watched everything from the sidelines, filed a report revealing that he had been collecting data and incidents for years, unsure of who to trust with the truth. His courage, overshadowed by the louder chaos around him, became another spark in the fire of change. As for the young woman who had nearly been buried by the system, she stood beside Amara that day on the courthouse steps, no longer a defendant, but an advocate. With her record cleared and her story known, she joined a legal fellowship aimed at offering representation to those wrongfully charged, working with Amara's team to draft new procedures that prioritized transparency and eliminated racial bias triggers in police reports. Her voice, once dismissed and silenced, now carried weight, and she used it to make sure no one would ever feel as alone as she once had. Amara's brother came to see her speak that day, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching his sister turn pain into purpose. Later that night, when the crowd had cleared and the streets returned to their usual rhythm, he sat across from her in a small diner, his eyes filled with the kind of pride that no award could match. He told her, "I used to worry they'd try to stop you. Now I realize the only thing more dangerous than them trying, was you stopping yourself." Amara smiled softly, her hand resting on her coffee cup, eyes distant but steady. "I never did this to be seen," she said, "I did it because I couldn't live in a world where they got to keep winning." And she hadn't done it alone. The quiet woman who had leaked the first flash drive now led an internal ethics unit within the DOJ, building whistleblower protections that ensured no voice would ever be lost in the dark again. Flores, Amara's supervisor, remained by her side, promoted to oversee reforms at the national level. Together, they trained a new generation of agents, not just in law enforcement, but in empathy, community, and transparency. They built a system from the inside, one that could no longer pretend not to see. Amara's life changed, but not in the ways most imagined. She no longer needed to fight for respect, it followed her now, even when she didn't ask for it. But what mattered more to her were the small moments. A letter from a teenager who watched her hearing and decided to apply to law school. A mother who thanked her for saying her son's name out loud in front of Congress. A retired officer who quietly handed over a thumb drive and said, "You gave me permission to do the right thing." Those moments stitched themselves into her life more deeply than any title or position. She had become a lighthouse, not a warrior, a symbol of what was possible when one person refused to be silent. And yet, even with all the victories, Amara knew better than to believe the war was over. She knew systems didn't collapse in a day. They evolved, adapted, tried new ways to survive. There would always be pushback, resistance, attempts to distract and distort. But now, she was prepared. Not just with evidence, but with people. Allies who had once stayed hidden were stepping forward. Communities were organizing, demanding oversight, rewriting the story city by city. As she looked out at the skyline from her new office in D.C., the hum of the city below like a song of resistance, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt rooted. She had not simply broken through the walls, she had built a door and held it open for others. And maybe that's what justice really looked like. Not punishment. Not revenge. But opening the path wide enough that no one ever had to force their way in again. Now I want to ask you something: how many times have you seen someone judged before they were heard? How often have you watched silence win while truth sat in the shadows? And more importantly, how many times have you convinced yourself it was too risky to speak, too dangerous to stand up, too lonely to be first? Because this story wasn't just about Amara. It was about all of us. About how easy it is to believe justice will come on its own. About how dangerous it is when good people wait for someone else to act. About how even a system built to protect can become the very thing people need protection from. So now, I ask you, what would you do in that courtroom? If it were your voice being mocked, your truth being ignored, your freedom on trial? Would you wait for someone like Amara to walk in? Or would you be her? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear from you. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Which moment made you stop and think? Which character's journey left a mark on you? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories with truth, fire, and unexpected turns, then make sure to subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist and hit that like button to keep these stories alive, because the world may try to silence the truth, but here, we make sure it's heard.